The lore of the Three Moon Sisters has always been this massive question mark that loomed over Genshin Impact's story, because on one hand, they're clearly supposed to be extremely important characters, but on the other hand, we don't really know much about them. And 10 days ago, from the time of the publishing of this video, Hoyoverse gave us a little bit of a hint when they revealed the titles of Arya, Sonnet, and Canon, who are supposed to be the Eternal, Iridescent, and Frost Moons respectively, assuming that they go by standard naming order. Again, we don't really know much about what the Moon Sisters did during the civilization of the Primordial One. However, we can use these new titles to try and predict what their roles were. Now, of course, we know that the Three Moon Sisters, Arya, Sonnet, and Canon, were part of the Primordial One's first civilization, since the Seelies worshipped and followed them during that era, and we have records of their existence through fairy tales such as the Moonlit Bamboo Forest, Xiphos' Moonlight and Sumeru, Heart's Desire from Mondstadt, all of those books and stories. The real question lies in what they did during that era and who they really were. Were they draconic in nature, which there is some evidence supporting that, since, of course, the shattered remains of the moon that Mavwika revealed are supposed to be part of the ancient dragon civilization. However, the Moon Sisters themselves were supposedly, at least from what we know so far, part of the Primordial One civilization. Let's remove the Raiden picture for now, put it on the side, it's not going to be important. Of course, when it comes to trying to decipher what the Moon Sisters did in the ancient civilization, we have to first look at the timeline of Celestia's rule. In the beginning, Teyvat was not Teyvat at all. We had the Light Realm, and in the Light Realm, all 7 elements were conjoined into one unified light. That's going to be the Omni element, which I think should represent Nibelung. At least that's the most likely outcome that we will learn later down the line when Conria comes out, or perhaps we learn it in 5.5, who knows, maybe Washaklahun Ubakan tells us something about it. So on the left-hand side, we are going to have the 7 elements, put it here, and alongside Nibelung, we had the 7 sovereigns. One such sovereign, for example, is Xiquotl, the Pyro Sovereign, who ruled over, well, I suppose the Pyro element, because back then there was no such thing as Natlan. And then we can fast forward to the arrival of the Primordial One and the defeat of the Ancient Dragons. This is when we came into the era of the first civilization. Of course, as we all know, since Genshin Impact is a playable video game right now, the first civilization did not last forever, and it collapsed. After the first civilization, we had the Archon War, and when the 7 Archons rose to power, we get the new Age of Teyvat, which I will call the Age of the Archons. Okay, great. So this is a very, very, very simplistic and rough outline of Teyvat's timeline. We have the 7 elements during the era of the 7 sovereigns, then we have the first civilization of the Primordial One, and then we have the Age of the Archons. This is only super major eras, we're not including all the minor ones, such as the time between King Deshret and Remus's Empire of Remuria, or Kingdom of Remuria, whichever one it was. We are only interested in the major ones, where the authorities of the world are transferred from one pantheon of deities to another. So, since we are trying to figure out where the Moon Sisters fit into this timeline and to which, I suppose, group of gods they belong, to which pantheon of gods they would belong, we are going to start by filling out everything we know. So we have the 7 dragon sovereigns filled, and the question becomes, moving forward, do we want to fill out the first civilization? Well, not yet. The next best option to go after is going to be the Age of the Archons, because this is the one where we have legitimate concrete information. For instance, we have the Geo Archon, we know who he is, that's going to be Morax, and we can very, very simply connect him directly to the element of Geo, since he has the authority of Geo. Let's make this one red. And then we have other Archons such as Barbatos, we've got the Tsaritsa, who I'm using Bronya as a filler, we have, well, let's not use Beelzebul just yet, let's use Baal. So Baal goes in Electro, since Makoto was the Electro Archon during this era, and we can simply copy-paste this one over here. And of course we have Rupka Devata, who takes on the element of Dendro. For the Pyro Archon, it's going to be Xbalanque. He was the one who killed Xiquotl the very first time, and he was the one who got the authority of fire. And the Hydro Archon is Focalors. Of course, you could do this. You could do Egeria, include her here, and then connect her to the element of Hydro. And after Egeria directly, we have Focalors, who was her Oceanid familiar and successor. And then after Egeria and Fossilors, we get Neuvillette, the reincarnation of the Hydro Dragon Sovereign. So far, he is the only playable ancient dragon in the game. Maybe Dvalin would become playable in the future, who knows? Perhaps Dvalin even has the Authority of Wind, since Barbatos may or may have not given him that. And then, of course, we have all the Pyro Archons who came after Xbalanque. Instead of listing every single one of them, we can just put them in a group, including Mavuika. Alright, perfect. So now that we have everything that we know for certain set up, the next question is, where do the Moon Sisters fit into all of this? Let me tell you where they fit. We have Nibelung. He was the master of the world during the era of the ancient dragons. He was, I suppose, the logos of the world. The element of the Omni element should belong to him, which is the conjoined light of all 7 elements, or all elements in general, because Genshin does hint that there is more than 7. After Nibelung, we had the first Descender, who shows up and defeats Nibelung, arrests the 7 authorities of the ancient dragon sovereigns, and takes on the Light Realm and creates Teyvat. Then we have the era of the Archons. Now, who rules Teyvat during the era of the Archons? We have several options. The first one that comes to mind is going to be Celestia, since Celestia is the island in the sky. Celestia are the arbiters of all laws on Teyvat, and Celestia is likely where the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles, who is probably the Commander-in-Chief at the moment, resides. You know what? I might as well grab the Sustainer from my other monitor. 1 second. There she is. Okay. So this is the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles. We all know her. We all love her. At least I hope we all do. And she is most likely the one ruling Celestia at the moment. Why is she ruling Celestia? Well, a quick fictional history lesson. After the Primordial One was wounded severely during Nibelung's War of Vengeance, they lost their ability to suppress the world. Neuvillette's vision story says the resentments of the world, which is quite a peculiar choice of wording. The Primordial One lost their ability to suppress the resentment of the world, and as a byproduct of the Primordial One's injury, the Archon War happens so that the authorities of Celestia, or the authorities of the ancient dragons, the thrones, could be passed down to the 7 strongest gods available. Now, there might have been a few other reasons for the Archon War, however, I suspect this was the main reason. And during that time, Celestia valued strength above all, because Barbatos was not supposed to be the Anemo Archon, it was supposed to be Andreas, the Wolf of the North. But Andreas gave up his position, just like how A gave up her position to Makoto. Then A killed herself, and Andreas technically also killed himself. And Amun gave up his position, but he did not kill himself. Well, he did kinda kill himself. His actions led to his own death, and then Rukkhadevata took on the throne. When it comes to Morax, he was the strongest one in Liyue, so it doesn't matter, and the Tsaritsa, we still don't know who her predecessor was, but we might know that in the near future. But originally, these Archons did not exist, just like how the Primordial One did not exist. The first Descender only came after Nibelung and took the authorities from the 7 dragons. Then somehow, something along the way during the story happened, and the authorities go from Nibelung all the way to Celestia, and from Celestia to each of the 7 Archons. And the question is, how did this happen? And what happened in between these 2 eras? Okay. Let's start with the easiest explanation possible. Who is the God of Life on Teyvat? The God of Life on Teyvat is the Shade of Life. So we're going to add her very quickly. We're going to have the Shade of Life. She is the one who created Egeria. And this makes Egeria kind of a god of life herself, since Egeria was the temporary heart of the Primordial Sea after the death of the original Hydro Dragon Sovereign, who was, of course, Neuvillette's predecessor, as Neuvillette says in the Fontaine Archon quest. But the Goddess of Life, or the Shade of Life, was not always the ruler of life on Teyvat. Before her, there was the Hydro Dragon Sovereign. He was the original god of life during the era of Nibelung, during the era of the Light Realm. The Shade of Life shows up, created by the first Descender. She usurps the role of the Hydro Dragon Sovereign. And like I said, since the Shade of Life is a goddess of life, we can also assume her creation, Egeria, is also a goddess of life. She is the heart of the Primordial Sea. The Primordial Sea is metaphorically and symbolically the womb of the world from which all life is born. And the current heart of the Primordial Sea, who is the third heart, is Neuvillette. He is the one who has the authority of the Dragon Hydro Sovereign as well, since at the end of the Fontaine Archon quest, what Fossilors does is she sacrifices her life so that Neuvillette can have the authority which originally belonged to his predecessor, predecessor was passed down to Egeria after the usurper king was wounded, and then from Egeria into Focalors, from Focalors to Neuvillette. However, we have to ask the question, did the authority get passed down from the Hydro Dragon Sovereign into the First Descender and then into Egeria? I don't think so. The most likely explanation is that the Shade of Life held the authority of water before Egeria, and then created Egeria out of that power as a new heart for the Primordial Sea. According to the Wings of Merciful Wrathful Waters, Egeria was created from materials that belong exclusively to Teyvat, which implies that Egeria was made out of the heart of the Hydro Dragon Sovereign, since she herself was a beating heart, and her heart is likened to that of a dragon in terms of its nobility. And only after Egeria's death could Neuvillette truly be born, and he himself become the third heart. So we have the first heart over here, that's the Hydro Dragon Sovereign, the second heart Egeria, and the third heart Neuvillette. Focalors was not a heart, however, she did succeed Egeria momentarily right before Neuvillette. However, Egeria was not born, or was not created, as far as we know at least, with the authority of water. Before she was an Archon, the one who likely held the authority of life was the Shade of Life. And the original god of life, if you have understood my explanation so far, would have been the Hydro Dragon Sovereign, since the current god of life, and the true god of life, not the usurper one, is Neuvillette. So why is this important? It's important because it sets a precedent. It is very likely that a Shade took on the role of a Dragon Sovereign in terms of taking on their authority, at least passed down through the First Descender who defeated the 7 Dragon Sovereigns. And if that is true, then we can link Ronova to the authority of fire. But then obviously there is a major problem, because Ronova never held the authority of fire, right? Yes, that is true. Ronova never held the authority of fire. The authority of fire was always left with Xicoatl until the moment of his death at the hands of Xbalanque. This is why Ronova specifically, by the way, descended upon Ochkanatlan after Xbalanque defeated Xicoatl, and told him about the calamity that was going to eventually damage Teyvat. We don't really know what that disaster is. We can assume it's the Abyss, since the Abyss seems to be the ultimate enemy of the entire world. So Ronova came down, talked to Xbalanque, and then gave him part of her power. And I find this interesting because Ronova specifically came down, and not any other Shade. This could be for several reasons. She might have been interested in more than just the authority of the Pyro Dragon. Yet, if the Shade of Life is connected to the authority of life through the Hydro Dragon Sovereign, and then into Egeria, into Focalors, and into Neuvillette, then there is a chance that Ronova wanted to take the authority of fire and claim it for the First Descender, or in the name of the First Descender, and in the name of Celestia in general. Regardless, did Ronova herself hold the authority of fire at any moment in time? No, she never did. Ronova gave a portion of her power to the holders of the authority of fire, and those holders used that power, or at least Mavuika used that power, to drive off the Abyss. And because of that, we can somewhat connect Ronova to the authority of fire. She's not necessarily a holder, but she lies somewhere in between the two. So now the question becomes, what about the other authorities? What about Istaroth, for example? Istaroth is called the Thousand Winds of Time, and she created, or at least had a hand in the creation of Barbatos in some way, shape, or form. So if the Shade of Life is connected to the authority of water, and Ronova somewhat oversaw the usage of the authority of fire, then we could confidently say that the authority of Anemo, or authority of wind from the Anemo Dragon Sovereign, could have been held by Istaroth, who is the Thousand Winds of Time. Or at least is called the Thousand Winds and is connected to the Thousand Winds of Time, and Barbatos was born as a wisp of these Thousand Winds. Thus, assuming all of this is true, we can then have Asmodee, who is most likely the current ruler of Celestia in place of the Primordial One, since the Primordial One, the First Descender, is asleep at the moment. Was it Lumine? It was, yeah, the Abyss Sibling. According to the Abyss Sibling, the Primordial One is asleep. The Sustainer of Heavenly Principles is sustaining the principles of the Primordial One, and she is most likely the Shade of Space, since she is based on Sirin, and Sirin is the Herrscher of the Void, and in Genshin Impact, the Sustainer Asmodee corresponds to the Cup of the Void, and the Cup of the Void in English is called the Goblet of Eonathim. So, the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles is the Shade of Space. Space involves the creation of objects, I guess, since this is what's part of what Sirin does in Honkai anti-impact third, and if that is true, which is most likely true, then the Shade of Space used to hold, or at least oversaw, the usage of the authority of Geo, or the authority of Earth. This might explain why both Asmodee and Morax use cubes in their power, because if you didn't know, Morax is the only Archon whose element manifests in the form of a cube. When it comes to every single Archon, other than the Tsaritsa, since we have yet to see her Statue of the Seven, each and every single one of them manifests their power in the form of spheres, with the exception of Morax, and this could be due to his connection with Asmodee. Now, of course, it wouldn't actually be due to his connection with Asmodee. The real reason would be because this is how the element of Geo manifests, and if Asmodee at some point in history held the authority of Earth through the First Descender, then it would be passed down to Morax, and both of them would manifest that power in such a way that it would be a cube. By the way, sorry if I can't talk, I just came back from a soccer match and we won, so that was good, but my voice will also take some damage along the way. Regardless, we have the 4 shades. They all can be connected to certain elements. As you can see, this leaves 3 elements that are empty. And as it so happens to be, during the era of the Primordial One, we have 3 moons. And what are these 3 moons called? They are called the Eternal Moon, the Frost Moon, and the Iridescent Moon. Now, who is the god of eternity on Teyvat? The god of eternity on Teyvat, who conveniently has a moon right behind her, well, at least had a crimson moon behind her, is Beelzebul. Beelzebul, and her sister Makoto, were the goddesses of eternity, thunder, and eternity, in the form of transience and stagnant eternity. So if Beelzebul is the current holder of the authority of lightning and the goddess of eternity, or the god of eternity, then she would be connected to the Eternal Moon, which is the one behind her, perhaps, maybe? Perhaps it's the Crimson Moon, but regardless, Beelzebul has a lot of lunar imagery, and that alone is enough to establish a connection. So, perhaps what we can do, if we have 4 shades for Hydro, Animo, Geo, and Pyro, we could have 1 shade, the eternal, or not shade, sorry, 1 moon, the Eternal Moon. So we have Eternal Moon for the element of Electro. Now, is there any other moon that would be easy to connect? Well, we have the Iridescent Moon. This one is a bit vague. You can kind of tell that iridescence is related to light, stuff like that. But what about the Frost Moon? Frost is, well, ice. So we've got the Frost Moon, and this one would be most obviously related to the element of cryo and the authority of ice, the power that the Tsaritsa currently holds. With this one, we don't really need to fill in the blanks. Rukkhadevata, or at least Kusanali. Kusanali says, I am the moon, the true sun is long gone. So Kusanali already likens herself to the moon. And then if you read the Sub-Zeru's festival description, they liken the Dendro Archon to the moon. Irminsul has also some mathematic connections to the moon. So the Iridescent Moon should be related to the authority of Apep, the authority of Verdure. That would be the authority of Dendro. So now we end up with 3 moons and 4 shades for each element. And then we have Nibelung. He is the master of the world. And we have the First Descender. He was, or they were, the master of the world after Nibelung. They both used this power, the Omni Element, or most likely use it if we go by Paimon. We don't know if Paimon is Phanes, however, she is likely connected to Phanes. Most likely Paimon is the daughter of the Celestial Emperor mentioned in the Legend of the Shattered Halberd, and that would make her official, technically, I suppose. The Omni Element, regardless, the Omni Element does now belong to Celestia, who are the spiritual successor of the First Descender as that one goes to sleep, and the ruler of Celestia at the moment is going to be Asmodee. Such an interpretation does create a few problems. Let me tell you why. The Primordial One came into Teyvat. They created 4 shades of themselves. One of these shades is Ronova, another shade is Asmodee, and from Asmodee's appearance we can very easily tell that she looks like Kiana Kaslana. So the Primordial One likely also looks like Kiana or Kevin, depending on what appearance they take on. If it is the case that the 3 moons are the ones representing Animo, Electro, Dendro, and Cryo, then that would mean the 3 moons are also part of the primordial one. But if the 4 shades are part of the usurper king, then what about the moon sisters? How are they part of the first descender? We can reconcile this by saying that the moon sisters are the lunar queen in the alchemical magnum opus, the union of the solar king and the lunar queen. The moon sisters would be the lunar queen, and then the usurper king, or what remains of the first descender, maybe the heavenly principles, that would be the solar king. Unless the 4 shades are the solar king, however, that would be weird. But now that I think about it, it makes sense. However, that is a whole different theory that I can get into in another time. So yeah, I'm not gonna stall any longer. I think you guys get the memo. We have 4 shades: Ronova for Pyro, Shade of Life for Hydro, Istaroth for Anemo, for Wind, the Eternal Moon is for Electro, the Iridescent Moon is for Dendro, Frost Moon Cryo, this one's very obvious, and the Geo Element with Morax and the Cubes and Asmodee is likely going to be for the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles, who is most likely the Shade of Void from the Goblet of Eonothem, and she is also probably the one who is currently ruling Celestia. 4 shades, 3 Moon Sisters, we have a very clean succession. We go from 7 elements, we have Nibelung, and then from Nibelung we go into the first Descender, and after the first Descender we have Celestia. During the Age of Nibelung we have 7 dragons. During the Age of the first Descender we have the 4 shades and the 3 moons, and then during the Age of Celestia, or the Age of the Archons, we have the 7 Archons. If you think there are flaws in this interpretation, completely fine, let me know that down in the comments. I will try to engage with them as much as possible. If you agree with it, that is also fine. Even if I disagree with this interpretation, once again, it's good enough to the point where I thought it is worth a video. So if you want to support it or deny it, feel free to do so. And when it comes to my actual opinion, you will know in 1 week. Thank you all for watching, take care, and once again, huge thanks to everyone who supports this channel on Patreon, and I will catch you in the next time. Beelzebul, how important you turned out to be.